The Martin Luther King Jr. Forensic Program was founded in 1973 on the campus of Howard University. Currently led by Professor Angela Minor, the nationally renowned team is made up of students who enjoy the art of public speaking and the challenge of the debate. In fact, they are the 2018 National HBCU champions in parliamentary debate. Recently, the group came to the WHUT studios to remember the legacy of the Reverend Martin Luther King through debate and spoken word.
Welcome everyone to the Great Debate, performed by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Forensics Debate Team, housed out of Howard University's School of Communications. I am your moderator, Angela Minor, director of the program. Kristen Love is a graduating senior political science and economics double major at Howard University. She has been actively involved in many facets of campus life. She is the vice chair of the Howard University Policy Board, University Admissions Ambassador, and a proud member of the International Fraternity of Delta Sigma Pi, Iota Rho Chapter, and a veteran of the Howard University Debate Team. London Davis, a junior sociology major, biology and Spanish double minor on the pre-med track from Houston, Texas. In addition to being a member of the Howard University Debate Team, London is a vice president of the Howard University's nationally ranked mock trial team, vice president of the College of Arts and Sciences Honors Association, chief of staff of the College of Arts and Sciences Forward Student Council, and a health and wellness liaison of the Office of the State of Superintendent of Education here in Washington, D.C. Side opposition negating the resolution is Kawan Rowland. He is a graduating senior majoring in political science and minoring in psychology. Born and raised in Jersey City, New Jersey, he will teach English in South Africa as Peace Corps volunteer after he graduates in May. Kawan currently serves as president of the Howard University Speech and Debate Team, as well as Charles Hamilton Houston's Pre-Law Society. Michael Franklin, a freshman majoring in legal communications and minoring in political science, born and raised in Kansas City, Kansas, aspires to run his own nonprofit think tank to craft equitable policy on state and local levels for marginalized bodies. Michael is currently the HBCU national champion in parliamentary debate and extemporaneous speaking, as well as the member of the nationally ranked Howard University mock trial team. As your moderator, they will be debating, this House believes that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would support Black Lives Matter. These are the rules of the debate. First, the Prime Minister, who is supporting today's resolution, the pro side, side affirmative, introduces their side of the argument in 7 minutes. Second, you will hear the leader of the opposition, side con, opposing today's resolution, introducing their side of the argument in 8 minutes. Third, member of the government, also the affirmative, the pro side, will offer their first rebuttal in 8 minutes. The fourth speaker that will grace the podium is a member of the opposition. They will offer their first rebuttal also in 8 minutes. The fifth speaker is leader of opposition. Their final rebuttal will be said in only 4 minutes. And the last speaker for today's debate is the Prime Minister, will defend their final rebuttal in 5 minutes. Additional rules for the debate. Points of information are questions, their statements, the opposing side can direct to the speaker on the floor. The speaker has the option to accept or deny a POI. In most parliamentary debate styles, POIs cannot be made during the first or last minute of each speech. known as protected time, nor can they be made during the final rebuttals. And let's get ready to begin the debate. Timekeeper, are you ready to begin? We'll hear from side affirmative, Prime Minister.
In 1957, when a group of us formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we chose as our motto to save the soul of America. We were convinced that we could not limit our vision to certain rights for Black people, but instead affirmed the conviction that America would never be free or saved from itself until the descendants of its slaves were loosed completely from the shackles they still wear. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., April 4th, 1967. I want you to ask yourself, has America loosed completely from our shackles? Has America been saved from itself? Because side government, because the affirmation believes the answer is no, because we know Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would agree to the same, we stand in strong affirmation of the resolve. This House believes that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would support Black Lives Matter. We base our argument on three main contentions. First, Black Lives Matter engages in the same non-violent direct action tactics of Martin Luther King Jr. Second, criticisms of Black Lives Matter are based in an inaccurate view of who Martin Luther King Jr. was. And three, the values of Black Lives Matter most closely align with Martin Luther King Jr.'s fights against the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. So as we begin this debate, let's contextualize what we're talking about when we're talking about Black Lives Matter. Side affirmation defines Black Lives Matter as a political and social movement originating among African Americans, emphasizing basic human rights and racial equality for Black people and campaigning against various forms of racism. This encompasses not just the organization itself, but the social, political, and economic facets within the movement. So understand that side, the affirmative side, is speaking about it in its entirety, denied. And we'll be having this conversation about all of that is encompasses within the Black Lives Matter movement. So contention one, Black Lives Matter engages the same nonviolent tactics of Martin Luther King Jr. Let's look to the Kingian philosophy and his 6 steps of nonviolent social change. First, information gathering, education, personal commitment, discussion and negotiation, direct action, and reconciliation. If we focus primarily on direct action, we can look to the King Center that defines direct action as these actions that impose a creative tension into the conflict, supplying moral pressure on your opponent to work with you in resolving the injustice. This is the main thing that we credit Dr. King for, so we can look to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, founded on January 10th, 1957, and the various movements of direct action that we credit to them today, beginning with the Montgomery bus boycotts, moving on to the Albany, Georgia movements in 1961, going to the Birmingham campaign in 1963, the March on Washington, the St. Augustine, Florida protests, all of which are examples of direct action that created creative tension. Now let's move to the Black Lives Matter global network to see that they're doing the same thing today in the modern age. We can begin with the Ferguson protests, move to the Baltimore uprisings, then to the New York Say Her Name campaign, the protests at Netroots Nation, the efforts for Campaign Zero, the highway disruptions that are happening all across the country. Again, these same non-violent direct actions forcing people to understand and create moral pressures, force the world to face uncomfortable truths, direct action, use the media to make the world aware, education, use personal commitment, DeRay McKesson, Opal Tometi, Brittany Packnett, and so many more denied, using this to bring politicians to the table, discussion and negotiation to reach a better future, reconciliation. This is the modern age of an age-old fight. Again, we can look to Martin Luther King. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Contention 2. Criticisms of Black Lives Matter are based on an inaccurate view of who Martin Luther King Jr. was. Let's understand that Martin Luther King Jr. did not have a national holiday in 1960. He wasn't widely admired. He wasn't quoted by Mike Huckabee at the time. He was persecuted by the government. His family was threatened on a daily basis. And at the end of the day, Martin Luther King Jr. was a victim of gun violence. So let's look to the Gallup polls in the 1960s that showed that freedom riders had a 61% disapproval rate. Sit-ins had a 57% disapproval rate. Demonstrations, 73% disapproval rate. The March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech, a 60% disapproval rate. Dr. King himself, 50% disapproval denied among the people in this country. He was called too disruptive, too excessive, too unrespectable. Again, as W.E.B. Du Bois states, the propaganda of history gives us a false but pleasurable sense of accomplishment. We can talk about who Martin Luther King is viewed as today, but remember in his time, he was called all the same names that Black Lives Matter continues to be called into this day. And this is why Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would support Black Lives Matter, because he was persecuted in the same ways they are today. Contention 3. The values of Black Lives Matter most closely align with Martin Luther King Jr.'s fight against the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. Critical to King's philosophy was the idea that we had to combat these three triple evils in order to achieve true equality. He notes that the King Center notes that this is all interrelated and all inclusive of all issues, from homelessness to homophobia to imperialism. All of these come together to fight a triple evil. Martin Luther King was not just revolutionary for the battles he won, but for the battles that he acknowledged we had yet to fight. Black Lives Matter are acknowledging and fighting the battles we did not acknowledge in 1960. Let's look to his speech in the Other America at Stanford University in 1967. He states, "Nobody can doubt the need if he thinks about the fact that since 1963, some 50 Negroes and white civil rights workers have been brutally murdered in the state of Mississippi alone, and not a single person has been convicted for these dastardly crimes." Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about police violence and unfair policing long before it was a hashtag and long before it was popular. And yet this conversation was happening in 1960. It's still happening now in 2010. So the idea that Martin Luther King Jr. would not be supporting this is simply false. And that's why you're going to stand with the affirmation and understand that Martin Luther King Jr. would be in strong support of Black Lives Matter.
Leader of the opposition.
Resolved. This House believes that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would support Black Lives Matter. Let me be clear. Side opposition is not proffering that we oppose Black Lives Matter. We know that either of us can become the next Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Alton Sterling, or Philando Castile anytime a police officer stops us. We are proffering that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would charge and evolve the movement from what it is now by employing the methods that he used during the Civil Rights Movement. These methods are as follows: a proactive movement as opposed to the reactivity of Black Lives Matter, the establishment of centralized leadership as opposed to decentralized nature that is Black Lives Matter, and finally, the seeking out of effective political alliances. Side opposition defines Black Lives Matter as a decentralized movement focused on the equality of all marginalized groups within America. This decentralized movement acts reactively. They did not march in Baltimore until Freddie Gray died. They did not march in Cleveland until Mayor Rice lost his life. They did not march in Texas until Sandra Bland was found in that cell. They did not march anywhere until one of the most devastating and blatant injustices that has plagued our community for centuries was realized once again. Dr. King did not wait for injustice before he acted. He understood that injustice was always there. And when he took to the streets of Selma, when he took to the streets of Birmingham, he acted knowing what was going to happen. He called the media to Selma. He called them to Birmingham. He called them to every single march as he planned it before he got there, to make sure that he was the one making headlines. He was not the one reacting to headlines as Black Lives Matter denied. When he took to the streets of Selma, the people of the Civil Rights Movement, they did not wait for their voting rights to be violated. They knew that when they got to that ballot box in November, their rights would be violated. Just as every black man knows that he might lose his life on every routine traffic stop. His movement, the movement of Dr. King, they fought the lions of injustice when those lions roared and when those lions slept. Black Lives Matter waits for the lion to roar. They roar back, and then they move on to the next lion without taking time to slay either one of them. In his letter from a Birmingham jail cell, Dr. King wrote, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. With this, Dr. King recognized the tensions and injustice that exist regardless of his action. In this, he decided that it is better to act in opposition than to just wait for oppression before you act. Secondly, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would challenge the decentralized nature that is Black Lives Matter. When most people think of the leadership of Black Lives Matter, they think of Doreen McKesson in his blue vest or Shaun King. Very few people know the names of Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, or Patrisse Cullors, the three women who founded the movement in 2013 as a reaction to the acquittal of George Zimmerman. The movement has since expanded internationally and now holds over 40 chapters worldwide. The problem is, these chapters rely too heavily on the membership within each chapter and not on a global, international scale. If we look at the movement that Dr. King led with the Southern Christian Leadership Council, we see that it's very clear that he was the leader of that organization. He had an idea, he passed it down to his subordinates, and his subordinates put that message out across the nation. Black Lives Matter does not work the same way. One chapter has an idea, one chapter acts on that idea, and only in the city that that chapter exists is that idea realized. The idea isn't spread until it makes the news, if it makes the news. That's the problem with the organization. If they found a centralized leader, they could have an idea, a movement, or anything pushed down throughout the entire organization. And all 40 chapters internationally were able to act and work together the same way that the Civil Rights Movement did with the SCLC. In the words of Dr. King, history is prophetic. If we look to history and we look at SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, we would see that this organization mirrors Black Lives Matter on a very, very specific scale. Black Lives Matter and SNCC were both member-led and organized as grassroots campaigns. The problem is that when SNCC became more prominent over time, they started not to see eye to eye with Dr. King any longer. There's different styles of leadership became diametrically opposed to each other. Dr. King's movement was, yes, authoritative, but it had one central leader who pushed an idea down, and the group acted on said idea. With SNCC and with Black Lives Matter, there is no central leader. Multiple ideas are being pushed forward at the same time, and those ideas may conflict within the organization itself, which leads that organization to conflict with other organizations that may become their political allies. That brings me to my last point. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would call for the establishment of effective political alliances as opposed to the autonomous nature that is Black Lives Matter. In his June 11, 1967 writing, The Black Power Defined, Dr. King states, Negroes should be natural allies of many white reform and independent political groups. You see, when Dr. King had that dream all those years ago, that dream did not only include a just world for Black Americans. That dream included a just world for all Americans, regardless of their race, regardless of their creed, regardless of anything else. Dr. King sought alliances anywhere they may be found to further charge his inclusive movement. In the same writing, Dr. King goes on to say, millions of underprivileged whites are in the process of considering the contradiction between segregation and economic progress. White supremacy can feed their egos, but not their stomachs. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. consistently took the time to see those viewed as his enemies to be his siblings instead. His movement understood that many of the economic injustices present in the Black community are echoed in white communities all across America. Black Lives Matter makes no effort to bridge the gap between these economically oppressed groups within America. And Dr. King would have that as his largest objection. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King is undeniably a supporter of Black lives. And no reasonable person can argue against the phrase, Black Lives Matter. However, Dr. King would see the flaws in how this movement is operated. He would not support Black Lives Matter until it was reorganized in a way that made it as effective as it could possibly be, using the tools afforded to us in the 21st century, rather than following the failures and mistakes made by organizations in the past. Thank you.
Member of the government.
Before I begin, I would like to thank the president of Howard University, Dr. Wayne A.I. Frederick. I would also like to thank my partner for engaging in this debate with me, as well as our coach, attorney Angela Miner, and WHUT for hosting this debate. Now, on to the debate. Resolved. This House believes that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would support Black Lives Matter for the following 3 reasons. 1, Black Lives Matter engages the same nonviolent tactics that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. employed. 2, criticisms of Black Lives Matter are based on a post-Omnius view of MLK Jr. And 3, Black Lives Matter actively combats the triple evils that MLK Jr. fought so vigorously against. Now, before I get to those contentions, I would like to address some things that side opposition mentioned. They mentioned that Black Lives Matter is reactive rather than proactive. On April 16, 1963, Dr. King wrote a letter from a Birmingham jail in which he said, in any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps. Collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. Denied protected time. I would like to argue that collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist is the very stage that Black Lives Matter makes sure that they take careful time in executing. Secondly, they mentioned that Black Lives Matter was far too decentralized. The beauty of MLK Jr. was that he engaged the masses. The beauty of MLK Jr. was that he could go from the Black Baptist Church to the White House and everywhere in between. The beauty of MLK Jr. is that he wanted to ensure that no matter who you were or where you were, you saw the injustices that existed in America, and that's exactly what Black Lives Matter is doing. They're engaging the multiple facets that exist in this country. Lastly, they mentioned autonomy, not reconciliation. Black Lives Matter is not trying to isolate Black people. Reconciliation for Dr. King, when you look towards the King philosophy, said nonviolence does not seek to defeat the opponent. Nonviolence is directed against evil systems, forces, oppressive polices, unjust acts, but not against persons. That's exactly what Black Lives Matter is fighting. They're fighting the oppressive polices. They're fighting the unjust forces. It's no secret that we started this race at a disadvantage. It's no secret that we started the race that is life in America as a Black person with a starting line back here when everyone else was up here. It's no secret that we were not equipped with the same tools and coaches and equipment that would allow us to be successful in this country. So what Black Lives Matter is trying to do is ensure that we move our starting line up. They're trying to make sure that we're running on the inside of the track so that we can catch up with everyone else who had a head start. Now, on to our 3 contentions. We define Black Lives Matter as a political and social movement originating among African Americans, emphasizing basic human rights and racial equality for Black people, and campaigning against various forms of racism. This encompasses not just the organization itself, but the social, political, and economic facets within the movement. So, to our first contention. Black Lives Matter engages the same nonviolent tactics as MLK Jr. The goal of MLK Jr. was to be expansive and involve the masses. The goal of MLK Jr. was to ensure that there were as many people involved for the fight for justice as possible. In a recent documentary put out, Hope and Fury, MLK, the movement, and the media, they discussed how MLK engaged the media intentionally so that everyone in America could see the injustices that were occurring. Black Lives Matter is using the media of today, in other words, social media, in order to engage the masses in a fight that is unfortunately still continuing over 50 years later. When we look at the King philosophy, there are 6 principles of nonviolence. 1, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. 2, nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. 3, nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. 4, nonviolence holds that suffering can educate and transform. 5, nonviolence chooses love instead of hate. And 6, nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of justice. When we look at the mission of Black Lives Matter, the organization, they state, we are expansive. We are a collective of liberators who believe in an inclusive and spacious movement. We also believe that in order to win and bring as many people possible and along with us along the way, we must ensure we are building a movement that brings us to the front. We affirm our humanity, our contributions to this society, our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. We work vigorously for freedom and justice for Black people and, by extension, all people. The guiding principles of Black Lives Matter are in line with MLK Jr.'s principles. Accepted.
That the movements under the moniker of Black Lives Matter are unified within their method.
I would contend that they're unified within their method, because in the same way that Dr. King had SCLC as a base, Black Lives Matter has Black Lives Matter, the org, as a base, and continues to multiply out and to ensure that multiple facets are reached. Now, the guiding principles, their guiding principles of diversity and restorative justice and collective values are the guiding principles that every Black Lives Matter chapter operates under. Dr. King sought to educate Americans on what it was like to be Black in this country, and Black Lives Matter employs toolkits to do just the same. Now, to our second contention. Criticisms of Black Lives Matter are based on a posthumous view of Dr. King. Today, we celebrate his holiday. We speak highly of his work. We think nothing but the best of him. But the MLK Jr. of the 60s was not beloved. The MLK Jr. of the Civil Rights Movement was not thought highly of. The MLK Jr. of his time was not the well-respected man that we know and love today. People argue that Black Lives Matter is disruptive, Black Lives Matter is too radical, Black Lives Matter causes tension, when MLK Jr. had said himself, nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and fosters such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. We who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. Injustice must be exposed, with all the tension its exposure creates, to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. Contention 3. Black Lives Matter actively combats the triple evils that MLK Jr. fought so vigorously against. As my partner so eloquently mentioned, we're talking about poverty, racism, and militarism. The King philosophy said that they are interrelated, they're all inclusive, and they stand as barriers to living in our beloved community. When we work to remedy one evil, we affect all evils. Black Lives Matter combats poverty of Black people by changing the disadvantages they were dealt. Black Lives Matter combats militarism of the police force, and they combat the systematic racism that is still prevalent in this country today. MLK Jr. said that he was cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. In a letter from a Birmingham jail, we get the famous quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." King goes on to say, "We are caught in the inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives in the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds." In his last speech, "I've been to a mountaintop," he said if he was looking at any other country, he could understand the denial of certain First Amendment rights, because that's not something they agreed to. But when he looks at this country, he says that somewhere he read of the freedom of assembly, somewhere he read of the freedom of speech, somewhere he read of the freedom of the press, somewhere he read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right, and that is exactly what Black Lives Matter is doing today, and that is why I urge you to side with the government today.
We will now hear from a member of the opposition.
Before I begin, I would like to thank WHUT for having us for this debate. I would like to thank my opponents for providing a great debate for everyone out here. I'd like to thank my coach, Attorney Angela Minor, for us being here today. And I'd like to thank the audience for being here. But we want some more energy from y'all, so let's do this. Resolved. This House believes that Martin Luther King Jr. would support Black Lives Matter, and we stand in firm negation of this resolution. And before I begin, I would like to start with a quote from the uncompromising leader and intellectual orator himself. "Every man of humane convictions must decide on the protest that best suits his convictions, but we must all protest." This was spoken by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. exactly 1 year before his death in New York City protesting the Vietnam War. While he supports protest and that everyone should protest, he will only support protests that best suits his convictions. And the method in which Black Lives Matter works does not best fit the convictions of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. There are 3 key reasons for why he would not support Black Lives Matter. First is that Black Lives Matter does not control their message. Secondly, is that he would disagree with the leadership style of Black Lives Matter. And finally, is because he believes Black Lives Matter has failed at achieving effective political alliances. And effective political alliances does not mean watering down your message to gain support of oppressors, but it means making your message known and making sure that they hear you. Beginning with the first point of controlling their message, it's important. The member of the opposing side stated that Martin Luther King Jr. had the beauty of engaging the masses, but he engaged the masses with a consistent message, a consistent purpose, and a consistent ideology, something that Black Lives Matter does not perform. When we take an article from National Public Radio in 2016, they evaluate how Black Lives Matter rose to prominence and a significant issue was identified. The movement has been driven by women, but the biggest voices are not. And you wonder why that is. You further see a study from NPR that identifies that within media, less than 5% of journalists are women of color. When you have a mass majority of people in media being white males or simply people who are not in the backbone of a movement, they're not going to accurately get that message out. And Black Lives Matter has struggled to get their message out. When the message is inconsistent and the message is not showcasing who they are as a group and who they are as trying to make a difference, their message will be manipulated. Accept it.
So are you suggesting that the problem with Black Lives Matter's message is that this country will not accept that it has female leaders?
The problem with Black Lives Matter's message is that they are not pushing women to the forefront of their movement and getting their message to be known. Rather, they are sending other individuals towards actually having that message stated. And when they do that, not only does it misconstrue their message, but it leads to contradictions that cause people to not support the movement. Another example of this is individuals seeing DeRay McKesson or Shaun King as leaders of the movement over Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. And this is extremely wild. While the opposition side brings up how there are different branches and different platforms within the Black Lives Matter movement, they don't note how these different platforms contradict one another. Let's take, for example, Black Lives Matter Dallas versus Black Lives Matter Minneapolis versus Campaign Zero. Now, Black Lives Matter Dallas is seen as a chapter having an impact to some, but ended up painting the entire movement in a negative light after the Dallas police shootings occurred. However, many people are unaware that Black Lives Matter Dallas is not an official chapter of the Black Lives Matter movement. They do not follow the platform of Black Lives Matter. They do not follow the platform that was crafted by Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors. Rather, this was a group led by a white pastor using the moniker simply to organize protests without any affiliation to the organization whatsoever. Yet they're supposedly to be the face of this movement. They're the ones whose message gets out into media and defines what Black Lives Matter should be. This is not something that Martin Luther King would support when you don't have control over your own message, when it's being co-opted by other individuals. Next, let's take the great DeRay McKesson and how he doesn't even support the platform of Black Lives Matter. Rather, he is affiliated with his own platform that he created called Campaign Zero. While they all may be great ideas that can spur change, the problem is that they're inconsistent. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would not support a platform that's saying one thing on one end and one thing on the other end. He wouldn't have that. That's not something that he would support, because we all know that he was unapologetic in his message. He always ensured that his message would get out, and he always ensured it would stay the same, because no matter what anyone said or no matter who anyone was, he was going to make sure that he said what he said. Next, let's look towards the leadership style. Let's look towards achieving effective political alliances. Solely using a hashtag has been ineffective at mobilizing people to make change. Some tweet a hashtag and they move on thinking that they've done their part of the movement. And that's not okay. That would not have earned Martin Luther King Jr.'s support. Rather, it would have earned his condemnation for the apathy that it has put within people, thinking that that's all they have to do. That's not all we have to do. A movement that simply relies on a hashtag is not something that would gain his support. It would gain his condemnation. It's important that we look towards a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as well. He says, "We will have to learn to refuse crumbs from this big city machines and steadfastly demand a fair share of the loaf." Listen, I'm tired of receiving breadcrumbs, and what Black Lives Matter is providing right now is simply breadcrumbs towards a movement. I want to eat. And I think y'all should too. Finally, Black Lives Matter has alienated political allies. Now, I completely agree that Martin Luther King was definitely hated back during his time and he was constantly threatened. However, He would not allow his message to be silent, and he would make sure that his message would be heard. He would not allow individuals to simply ignore what was happening. In a social media study from Think Progress in 2016, a study was done after the murders of Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, and the officers in Dallas. They evaluated outreach on Twitter from members of Congress, and the results were appalling and stark. 60% of Democratic members of Congress never stated the name of Alton Sterling or Philando Castile. Yet 76% of Democratic members of Congress had words of sympathy for the officers gunned down in Dallas. For the Republican Party, the results were even more disgusting. Only 3% of Republican members of Congress mentioned Sterling or Castile by name. 3%. 62% of Republican members tweeted about the Dallas police shootings. The silence from the governing political is deafening. It is a form of apathy and inaction that is unacceptable. Movements that would gain Martin Luther King's support would have stronger success at making sure that they were forcing people to acknowledge his message, forcing people to acknowledge the injustices going on, and forcing that coverage be thrown back in their face to show that we are here. Finally, it's important to understand that with the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., movements must put themselves at the forefront towards making a change. And I would like to end with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself. History will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. Black Lives Matter must ensure that the good people speak. They must force them to speak. And right now they aren't doing that. Thus, they would not have the support of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Leader of the Opposition, final rebuttal.
Resolved. This House believes that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would support Black Lives Matter. We stand firmly in opposition to this resolution. Side Affirmative came before you and they tried to rebut a few of our points, so I'll clean up any mistakes that she made in her speech. She talked about Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail cell and gave you his 4 points for nonviolent action. What she failed to do, however, was define what he meant by self-purification. Dr. King, when defining self-purification, talked about going down to Birmingham and Selma weeks before his protests and training people to act and respond to violence in a nonviolent way. This defines proactivity and planning his protests. She used this as a rebuttal to Black Lives Matter's reactivity. In that letter, in that position right there, Dr. King was saying that he is against reactive protest and is all for proactivity and making sure that people are prepared and ready to do what is necessary to bring the world closer to justice. Next, they said that our view of MLK was based on an inaccurate post-mortem view of how he is seen. Every position, every idea that we presented to you today was something that Dr. King said or did while he was alive, not the words and things said about him after his death. Everything that we've told you came directly from the mouth of MLK or was directly viewed as one of his actions. Finally, they said that we have an inaccurate view of Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter is based in fighting poverty, racism, and militarism around the world. The thing is, when it comes to Black Lives Matter's combat of poverty, it's in direct contradiction to how Dr. King tried to fight poverty. When Dr. King fought poverty, he fought poverty for every American, be they black, white, Hispanic, or Asian. Black Lives Matter sees poverty as an issue that only plagues marginalized groups of color in America. I'm not saying that their stance is wrong, I'm saying that it goes against what Dr. King believed. Dr. King believed in making sure that every American, even if they were white, had the right to be helped out of their economic situation. He understood that the economic problems plaguing Black America plagued white America too. Black Lives Matter refuses to admit that. Nowhere on their website do they say anything about helping poor white Americans out of their economic plight, knowing that they get more food stamps than we do. Now, back to our points. Black Lives Matter is far too reactive. They are not proactive in their protests. They wait for something to happen, react to that headline, and hope that they make another headline as a result. Dr. King didn't wait for any headlines. He walked down to wherever he had to, did what he had to do, said what he had to say, and got the job done before any injustice, before any oppression had to rear its ugly head again. He fought the lions of injustice on the battlefield. When they roared, he roared back, and he fought until he slayed those lions. Black Lives Matter, they stop fighting. When the lion roars, they roar, then they move on to the next one. They leave that lion there to roar at the next black person that walks up. They leave that lion there to cause more damage to more people. Dr. King didn't leave any lion standing. Next, Black Lives Matter is decentralized. It has no central leader. Take a second and think about it. When you think Black Lives Matter, do you see any single face? Do you see any one person that can help you see where that movement is going? Odds are you don't. When you think of the SCLC, there's only one face that anyone will ever see, and that face is Dr. King's. And it goes beyond that. When you think of the American Civil Rights Movement, and you think of a face that equates to that, odds are that face is also the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a central leader. He was a figurehead. Black Lives Matter, without a figurehead, cannot spearhead any movement. Finally, political alliances move the world forward. Whenever legislation is trying to be passed in Congress, it doesn't get anywhere unless Republicans and Democrats find a way to agree on what's going to happen. With Black Lives Matter, they don't try to form any political alliances. They have their agenda and they try to push it. They don't try to bring people from the other side of the aisle to understand their point of view and get things forward in a slow, step-by-step process. Dr. King understood that democracy, America, the world, it doesn't work that way. You need to meet people halfway. You need to work step by step. Your agenda will move slowly, but Dr. King understood that it will still move. Thank you.
Prime Minister will defend their final rebuttal.
Before I begin, and in my last speech of my forensics career, I would like to extend the thank yous that my partner presented and extend a special thank you to my wonderful debate coach, attorney Angela Miner, for her 4 years of support in supporting not only my shenanigans, but also supporting my growth into the person that I am today. And with that, I will begin. My partner says, the side opposition states as he begins his speech, but we all must protest, and then proceeds to spend 8 minutes and 4 minutes criticizing the protest of Black Lives Matter movement. That doesn't equal out. He says that the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. are, but we all must protest, and says, however, that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would criticize the protests of other people, neglecting the fact that in his time, in the 1960s, the protests of various people existed without criticism from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We can look to SNCC, who actively criticized the efforts of Dr. MLK Jr., as well as Malcolm X, who existed in the same time period. All of these efforts, all of these different forms of protest existed in the same space, in the same way that Black Lives Matter movements can exist with the protest presented by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But moving on to some other points they bring up, they find that Black Lives Matter relies on a hashtag, and yet they can't point out the fact that Black Lives Matter Memphis and Atlanta raised $33,000 to bail Black mothers out of jail right before Mother's Day. They can't look to the fact that in Charlottesville, the Black Lives Matter organization in that area provided support and resources to the protesters who were protesting against the Nazi members who were actively fighting against and trying to take down a statue in the area. They can't point to their accomplishments, and yet they also try to minimize the efforts of black women in the movement by neglecting the fact that they are recognized within their movement. We can point to the website that they love to quote, and that website explicitly says history of the people who founded the Black Lives Matter movement, pointing to Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. If we want to look to the idea about alliances, we can look to the fact that Alicia Garza, again, the black woman who founded Black Lives Matter movement, was an organizer behind the Women's March and one of the main members of the platform established by the Women's March, a national coalition. Again, we can also move to the fact that she's an organizer behind the National Domestic Workers Alliance, again, another alliance working towards effective change. So Black Lives Matter as a movement, as an organization, not only doesn't simply rely on a hashtag, they're doing work all across this country, but they also are able to create alliances and create change. Again, we can even point to the Netroots Nation's protest when they're getting national attention of national Democratic candidates, including Bernie Sanders, including Hillary Clinton, who all met with members of the Black Lives Matter movement. So when they talk about this movement isn't effective, they're wrong, and they're wrong, and they're not using the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the correct way. Again, we can look to the Other America speech in 1967, that establishes that in final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. It is what America has failed to hear, and it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. What has changed since the 1960s when they say that we need to make that Black Lives Matter needs to be a movement that is inclusive in recognizing the rights of all people in the country. They're right in some forms, but let's not forget that this country for far too long has neglected the rights of black people. So when Black Lives Matter argues for the rights of black people, they're arguing for what has gone ignored from the moment that we were brought on ships over to this country. Again, as my partner stated, we started back here when other people were up here. Dr. Martin Luther King acknowledges when he said at the same time the Negro was freed from bondage of physical slavery, but at the same time, the nation refused to give him land to make that freedom meaningful. Let's look to the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, who acknowledges the fact that equality for black people is equality for all people. When we address those triple evils that we brought up and our side opposition fails to argue about at all, when we push for those rights of poverty, racism, and militarism, when we argue and fight for equality on all of those fronts, we're increasing equality for all black people. In the last 2 years of his life, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was continuously seen wearing a pin that said, "Black is beautiful." Let's understand that fighting for the rights of black people is fighting for the rights of all people in this country, because we're the ones whose rights were neglected for the longest period of time in this country. And Dr. Martin Luther King's own words from the end of his life, from 1967 into 1968, argue for that same, saying that on that same facet. So for the reasons that Black Lives Matter engages the nonviolent tactics of Martin Luther King Jr., the criticism of Black Lives Matter are based on an inaccurate view of who he was. And the values of Black Lives Matter most closely align with combating the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. It's why you'll stand with side affirmative in today's debate.
This concludes our debate. Or the resolve, this House believes that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would support Black Lives Matter. At this time, I would ask the debaters to shake hands. And this concludes our debate. We will now have spoken word performed by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. debate team members.
A tribute to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The Negro is still not free.
Over 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. Over 100 years later, the life of a Negro is still crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. Over 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. Over 100 years later, the Negro is still languishing into the corners of American society and finds himself exiled on his own land. So we come here today to dramatize a shameful condition.
Boom, boom, boom. Young black man killed. Unarmed, yet he provoked fear. No weapon seen or found besides the color of his skin, which was overwhelmingly profound. He never made it to college. He had no chance to escape. gunned down simply by those who hated his race. No avenue to prosperity, no gateway to success. 1, 2, 3 bullets to his chest. Mama crying, my baby. Media saying defense. Why does the color of our skin make people so tense?